For the bumper, the solution is really what we have on the enemy, our stomp detector. I'm going to create a new scene, but note that you can right-click and save the branch as scene to create some reusable bumper that you can place on the enemy and that you can use externally. If you were making a more complex game, you would want to create some kind of generic object that you could attach to your level design item or the enemy. But we are going to create a separate scene here. So new scene, create a custom node, and we are going to use an area 2D here. So let's call it bumper. For the collision, I'm going to put it on a new layer, the layer 5. It's going to be the bumper layer, and it's going to mask only the player, layer 1, for this one. And so I'm going to add in the assets folder the bumper 1 that we have in there, and try to center it in the view. Okay. And we want some collision shape or collision shapes. So Control A, add a collision shape 2D. And I'm saying collision shapes because you can use several shapes to match this form here, the head of the bumper, as closely as possible. Until now, we've been using only rectangle shape 2D, but you can use a capsule shape 2D, for example. So this one, we have to move around and rotate. You can move with the W key, and you can use E to rotate and S to scale. So I'm going to rotate the shape 90 degrees, press Q to go back to the select mode, and be able to expand my capsule. So you first want to set kind of the length, but you don't go to the extent of the sprite because the second point controls the radius of the half circles that you can see here. And as a result, pulling it expands the shape outwards as well. So I'm going to place it at the base of my bumper. But now the head of the bumper is not being covered by this shape. There is collision shape 2D that allows you to create pre-made geometric shapes, more or less. And there is another one called collision polygon 2D. And collision polygon 2D allows you to draw the polygon that you are going to create. So I'm going to move the origin of that polygon here. And then in the toolbar, you can see the icons to build your polygon, just like building the collisions from the tile set, etc. And there you can create points. I'm going to click, one click to create a new vertex there, and then click on the origin to close the shape. From there, it automatically switches to the node select tool, edit points, where you can click and drag on any point to move it. So you want to make sure that this shape is inside of the collision shape 2D to have, let's say, a relatively clean collision shape. Now the area 2D is going to use both of these shapes at the same time as long as disabled is off. So as long as the shape is enabled, which it is by default. So with that, you can save your scene in the source objects folder. We're going to create the bumper here. As you can see, I'm recording this a bit later in the project after doing chapter 2. That's why I already have that objects folder in my project, but you can create it by right-clicking on source, new folder, create a folder called objects here. Anyway, I'm going to go to project settings, and go down to the physics layer, 2D physics layer, to add my bumper layer, like so. And with that, going back to the player scene, I'm going to open it. I want to configure it so that it bumps onto our bumper. Now, the thing we have here is that we've been using an enemy detector node to detect the enemy, whether an area or a body entered that node. I'm going to duplicate it to separate the part where we detect when an area enters and we bump from dying being touched by an enemy. So I'm going to press Ctrl D to duplicate the enemy detector, and I'm going to create a stomp detector here and disconnect the signals in my node tab. So I only want the area entered signal connected to the player. Create the function automatically at the bottom of the script. I'm going to move it up to the top and replace that on enemy detector area entered here with on storm detector area entered. Now we have to do two things. One, disconnect the area entered signal from the enemy detector. I'm going to do that. Okay, done with signals. Then configure the storm detector, the collision tab, to mask not the layer 2, but layer 5 here, the bumpers. Okay, and then I want to change the collision shape 2D on this node. So for this node, I don't want to directly edit the collision shape because, as you'll see, it also affects the enemy detector. In Godot, you have the notion of resources. Often, the elements you create in the inspector here, like the shape, are resources. And the point with resources is that they are, by default, shared between nodes. So the point is creating, for example, a collision shape that you will reuse on different objects in your game. Here, though, we want the storm detector to be at the bottom of the character. So I'm going to go to shape, click on the arrow, and you can click on make unique to make that shape unique. And when I click on the control points, you will see that it does not edit the other shape at the same time. So I'm going to make this one smaller. I'm going to make it fairly large. Press W to move it down to the bottom of the character. So now we really have a shape dedicated to detecting things we can bump on and should be below the character or really at the bottom here. Last but not least, this will work for the interaction between the player and the bumper. So I'm going to open my level template scene, move my player a bit to the left, look for my bumper, and click and drag. I'm going to select the level template here to add it to the scene. I will also maybe move the enemy out of the view so it doesn't bother us. And now I can automatically bump onto the bumper. And so it is the interaction between the storm detector here, so this area, and any collision shape, so either the collision shape 2D or collision polygon 2D of the bumper. As soon as they touch one another, the storm detector emits that signal, which calls our storm detector area entered signal. Now we have to make a change to the enemy to use that layer that our storm detector is scanning for, the bumper one. So Control-Shift-O to open the enemy scene. And for the enemy, you have the storm detector collision shape 2D and storm detector node. You want to go to the collision tab, remove it from layer 2, add it to layer 5. It becomes a bumper. And with that, I'm going to move the enemy back closer to the player. F5, we can bump on the enemy once again. Now, one thing to fix at the very end, you can see that the bumper is in front of my player here, and it's an element in my levels that I'd like to have behind the player. It's more part of the background, right? To do so, in your scene tree, you want to ensure that the bumper is above the player in the list, in which case I'm going to move my player and you can see that the player comes in front of the enemy. Note, by the way, that our player is behind the enemies in the hierarchy. This is not a problem because as soon as you touch the enemy, like so, you are going to die, so you don't really get to see it. And if you jump above the enemy, you're going to bump on it and kill it. So the enemy is going to disappear, so you never see that interaction. But you may want to put the player, for example, at the bottom of the list in your levels, so that the player comes in front of the portal. I forgot one detail. We wrapped our enemies and coins into a simple node that kind of resets their drawing order. It makes these coins and enemies be on some kind of separate drawing layer when we do so. So we can change the type of these container nodes here that we only use to organize our scene. Right click on it, change type, node 2D. Right click on coin, change type, node 2D. And in that case, now the player will draw in front of the coin and of the enemy. I want the coins to be in front of the player, portals behind, and enemies behind. So that way we have the right drawing order. So when we interact with a coin, the animation of the coin will be in front of the player. When we interact with an enemy, the enemy is behind the player. Imagine you make your character invincible and you add some death animation to the enemy. The enemy will be behind the player at all times, allowing the player to see where the character is. And same for the portal. When the character enters the portal, imagine you make an animation where you go inside the portal and scale the character like so. Going inside the portal, you might want the player to be in front of it. So that is it. But with this, you have the bumper exercise solved, and we've done even a tiny little more.